You guys spend every single week yelling about officials. So instead of continuing to yell, we're going to have a real conversation with Dean Blandino, who knows more than everybody to figure out the source of the problem. Plus, one expert is going to tell us everything we need to know about the future of Bill Belichick. We've got all that and more because I'm Jason Fitz, and it's time for Zero Blitz. All right, so as much as everybody loves to yell and scream, I like to have nuanced conversations with smart people. And I think it's important, more important now than ever before, because the one thing everybody yells about every single week is officiating. And y'all know, like, I'm a Raiders fan. If there's anybody that's at the Tuck rule still lives in my life, like, I understand pain and agony over officiating, but I don't understand necessarily the way we always cover it. So we're going to get smarter today, and we're going to do that with Dean Blandino. Now, Dean, you see him on Fox. He's the FOX Sports Rules Analyst. Also, you saw him with the XFL, where we worked together when I was at ESPN. I got to interview him a bunch about XFL rules. So, Dean, first and foremost, thanks for hanging out with me and answering the back call, because I always enjoy being able to talk to you about the difficulty of it, the situation of all of it. I appreciate your time, my friend.
Yeah, of course. I think this is an important conversation to have, because I think, like you said, we complain a lot about officiating, and I think there is a more nuanced conversation to talk through as we kind of dive into what officials actually go through.
So let's start with the big call everybody's talking about, Kadarius Toney's foot. Depending on the camera angle, which we'll get into, everybody on Twitter was all emotional about it. From your standpoint, was it the correct call the way it went down?
Yeah, you take that call in a vacuum, he's offside, right? The neutral zone is the length of the football. The only player on either side that can be over the ball is the snapper, the center, and everybody else has to be on their side of the football. So Toney is offside in that situation. And look, I don't think if that pass is incomplete, it's not that big a deal, right? It just took back such an incredible play with Kelsey throwing it back to Toney, the go-ahead touchdown. And I think the fact that offensive offside is not something you see called very often, at least historically, I think all of that added to the controversy. Now, for me, there's mechanics that go into this. During the game, when a player is potentially lining up offside or close, you want to warn that player, and you want to give that player an opportunity to correct it, so you don't get into a situation late in the game where the player is clearly offside and the official cannot ignore that infraction. So I think there's a lot that goes into it. But, he was offside. It's ultimately the player's responsibility to line up correctly. And it was a violation.
So let's get to the warning, because even this morning on First Take, I heard Orlovsky screaming at Stephen A. about it. Where is the player obligation versus the official's obligation to make sure a warning is given?
Yeah, I think the obligation is the player to line up correctly. How it's evolved over time, because it's called preventative officiating. You want to help correct things before they happen, because no one wants a bunch of flags. Officials don't want a bunch of flags, but they can't ignore infractions. So early in the game, if there's an opportunity, if Toney is lining up close to the neutral zone, you'd want to take that opportunity to talk to him after the play, say, hey, 19, you got to back up. Make sure the coach is made aware of that, and take that opportunity early in the game. Now, there was an opportunity I went through, and I know Dan Orlovsky went through the game. I went through the game with about 12 minutes to go in the first quarter. There's a snap where Toney is right in the neutral zone. That would have been the opportunity to say, hey, you've got to move back. And then you hope that the player then takes that and he corrects it. Ultimately, the officials want to help. They want to give, especially off the ball. You see that a lot. Receivers will look to the sideline. I'm off the ball. I'm on the ball. The official will give them the line of scrimmage and make sure. But ultimately, the officials want to help, and they will. But it's on the player to line up correctly.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, because it's the way the play ended up. And I think we forget sometimes, split-second snap of the ball, official throws the flag. Like, he threw that flag before the play was ever complete. I don't know, Dean, that I want to live in a world where an official sees an infraction and just because of the time and place of the situation now has to decide whether or not they're going to call that call because of the moment. Like, that just feels like that's adding an element that's a slippery slope to me.
It's exactly right. It's another layer. And anytime you add another layer, you become less consistent. If you you replay that, that snap, the flag comes out immediately. It's a foul at the snap. The official has no idea what's going to happen on that play. And they can't even think about that anymore because they have to officiate the rest of the play. So if now we're going to say, oh, we're going to wait to see what happens. Is it a touchdown? Is it a big play? I don't want to be the one to decide the game. I'm not going to throw my flag. Or maybe it's a 2 or 3 yard gain or an incomplete pass. That's an added layer. And that would be a slippery slope that I don't think anyone would if we went down that path. I think we'd be saying, no way, we got to come back to just officiate what you see. You don't officiate. You don't take the outcome of the play into consideration. Was there an infraction? Was it clear? Make the call. Or if it's not clear, leave it alone.
Is there a moment, educate me, educate the world, that we always see officials huddle up? Is there a moment in that huddle where one official looks at another and says, is that call really worth it in this moment?
I don't think that is said in that exact way. I do think when you see officials huddle, what's happening is one official has seen something from their perspective and another official has seen something from a different perspective. And they're going to have that conversation. Here's what I saw. And they have that conversation. And ultimately, the official that threw the flag can elect to pick up the flag based on new information. That conversation is not, hey, this is a really big play. Are you sure you want to be, decide the game like this? It's, hey, I saw something different. What did you say? They have that conversation. Now, they do have conversations on certain rulings. There's certain rulings that replay can correct, and then rulings that replay cannot correct. So you're always going to lean towards, hey, if we're not sure if it's close, let's go with the ruling that gives replay the entire availability to come in and correct something if it is a mistake.
Okay, so a couple of blunt questions that are going to have blunt answers that half the world aren't going to believe because everyone's conspiracy theorists. But let's just ask it right out. Do you believe, or in your experience, has the league ever, in your mind, tried to influence officials to create the outcome of the game that they want?
No. And I was the head of officials, and I have people that are close to me. I have family members that think the NFL is scripted. The NFL even did, right? They had a commercial kind of leaning into the whole thing with the conspiracy and the script. No, the league has never, in my experience, has never done that. Now, what you do, you have to, if we see, hey, we're calling a bunch of fouls for offensive holding and we're being too technical. This is not a foul. This is not what is the rule book defines as holding. You'll give the officials that direction, but it's more big picture. It's not, hey, we want to see the Chiefs and the Patriots in the AFC Championship game. We have to make sure that we don't call fouls against them and more on their opponents. That doesn't happen. And the officials are evaluated, and they're evaluated on every call. There isn't a profession. I can't think of a profession in the world that has more scrutiny than officials. And not just football. That could be any sport. They are scrutinized in-game immediately. They have replay over their shoulders that can change an immediate decision. They have fans, they have coaches, they have players, they have the media, and then they have their own evaluation. Officiating department evaluates their calls that they make, the calls that they didn't make, their positioning, their mechanics. All of that goes into their evaluation for the season. If they grade out well, they get a postseason assignment. If they don't, they're sitting home. And if they don't grade out well, they can be let go. So there are a lot of factors and a lot of things that officials have to worry about rather than, hey, I'm a Bengals fan and I want them to win this game.
But in a world where we've gotten used to, for example, completion percentages, and we know windows that are good or bad for quarterbacks, I guess why not, in my mind? Because to your point, if they're graded and everybody knows the officials and who's good and who's bad, and they know tendencies of different crews and what they call, why do we not learn that? Why don't they, at the beginning of the game, when they tell us who the ref is, why don't they tell us this crew calls this percentage of these types of plays and their accuracy percentage has been this? Like, by publicizing the information, couldn't the league essentially maybe quell some of the loudness roars of conspiracy theorists?
I think it could. I think with more transparency, you can reduce that noise. And I think that's important. I don't know if they'll ever they don't even give the clubs the grades, what the officials are graded. The clubs do their own scouting. They scout the officials just like they scout their opponents. They know the tendencies. They know this crew coming in. They call more defensive pass interference. So we have to be less physical in the secondary, those types of things. So the teams do scout the officials. The league doesn't put that information out. But like we did in the XFL, if the NFL would create more transparency and let people in, listen to the conversations when the officials are talking, listen to replay, see what goes into it. That eliminates any conspiracies, because these are just people trying to do a job and trying to do it the best that they can. And to be able to hear that and listen, and that's what we learned in the XFL. The narrative around officiating completely switched, did a 180, because it was positive, because they said, hey, I get it. I may not agree with the ultimate decision, but I understand the why. And I think that's so important.
I mean, I'll peek behind the curtain here. When I was doing the XFL show with ESPN at the time, and you were obviously the person that was on camera, it was a crazy moment in one of our production meetings. We thought there was a terrible call, and then it went to review, and you looked at it, and because you were mic'd up and we could hear you break it down, you're like, all right, I may not agree with him, but at least I understand the logic. You and I talked about it in the moment. Why right now? I mean, the NFL watched the XFL. Why are there not Dean Blandinos at every game that can then come in mic'd up and review these things?
Well, there's only one Dean Blandino. That's the fact, right? But there can be more transparency. And I think, look, the reality is the XFL, it's a new league. You don't have the built up, the foundation that the NFL has. So you've been around for 100 years. To just completely pull the curtain back, that's a big ask, and it's a big lift. But I do think that there's an opportunity for the NFL to do more of that, to let people in, let them hear, let them watch and understand. Or even if it's after the fact, you've got social media say, hey, here's why we made this decision, right? These are the factors that went into it. Put that out so at least people can understand. I did that when I was at the NFL with my Twitter account. We would put that out. That, grows legs and it gets around. And at least people, they, like you said, you may not always agree with it, but at least you'll understand the logic behind it.
This is part of why I hate when people say anything is worse than it's ever been in history. And part of the reason I went down this rabbit hole, because I did a Google search on, worst calls in NFL history. And it was funny seeing games in the 60s I'd never heard of where clearly there were so I guess when we look at the way the game is covered today, is officiating worse than it has been, or is it just covered more, I guess, with more with closer eyeballs?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think if you go back, and I've seen it and I've watched, there are plays from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, prior to replay, where you would go, if that happened today, it would be a complete, like the internet would explode. There's a play, I forget what year it is. It's like 1957 playoff game in New England. A fan on 4th and goal, a fan is on the field and bats down a pass. And the Patriots win, and the fan runs off the field, and the game ends. Imagine that happening today. So officiating is better than it's ever been, but the scrutiny is so intense. I do feel like the last couple of years, though, we are, from an on-field perspective, relying a little bit too much on technology. I think they have their wireless communication. I think the officials on the field are less decisive because they're deferring more to replay, where you have to make a decision on the field and then let replay come in if needed, not the other way around where, I'm not sure, so I'm just going to not do anything and let replay correct it. So that's the one thing I think we're a little bit lacking right now. But from a training perspective, from video, from the ability to meet virtually on Zoom and everything else, it's never been better. It's just the scrutiny continues to increase, and it's one of the hardest jobs to do.
So how does the league view that scrutiny? Because, I mean, bad timing here, but we have the league owners meetings going on right now, right after Twitter's exploding over this call. So in your experience with the NFL, how does the fan reaction impact the way they view all of this?
Look, they hear it, right? They don't ignore it. There are very smart people at the league office, and they're not naive that, look, the way the fans view your game and view your officials, that hits at the integrity of the game and the officials and everything else. So they don't ignore it, but I think there is among some people a sentiment of people are always going to complain about officiating. It's human. There's a human element that we're always going to have to live with. And I think sometimes we get into that mode at the league office where, it's just, it's not a problem because people are always going to be upset about officiating. And I don't think that's the right approach. I think there are some issues. I think there are some issues that need to be addressed, and they can be addressed. But I think the league, they hear it, but ultimately, are they willing to put the resources in and really take a deep dive into officiating, the structure of the department, how the officials are being trained, and really take that initiative to look at it and say, are there areas for us to improve? And I'm not sure they're ready and willing to do that at this point.
After an instance like we saw last week, when everybody's yelling about it, does the league then go to officials and say, hey, just a word to the wise, make sure we're doing a warning? Like, are we going to see more warnings next week?
I don't know if we'll see more warnings. That's pretty standard. That's 101, where you're going to warn, you're going to talk to especially the tackles being up on the line of scrimmage. I think it'll be addressed, no question. It'll, make sure that we talk to the players. If you have an opportunity, like with Toney early in the game, correct it, because the officials, no one wants. That's one of the greatest plays that we may ever see. And it gets called back on what is a foul, but maybe it could have been prevented had we talked to him earlier in the game. And it's just one of those deals that make officiating so hard, because you can make the right call in the moment and people are still going to be upset.
That's the weirdest part. Like, I don't know what we want from officials. Like, I don't know.
They want perfection, and it's not possible. Like, it's not possible. And I think that's the standard. And I've had two different coaches tell me the same thing in two separate conversations, that there's three groups that affect games: coaches, players, and officials. And officials make the fewest mistakes. But the expectation is perfection. And there's 153 and a half plays per game in an NFL game. There are 7 officials. They make decisions before the play, during the play, and after the play. So there's thousands of decisions that are made every game. And the overwhelming majority are correct. We don't talk about those. We talk about the 3 or 4 where it's close, or it's controversial, or it's incorrect. That's a hard environment to work in. There's no winning in that environment. You're just trying to reduce mistakes and mitigate those mistakes. And that's hard.
It doesn't that speak to why, to go back to what we said earlier, decisiveness is key. Like, look, you're going to make a mistake, so you might as well be decisive. If you start questioning yourself when you're making thousands of mistakes, but I don't want to live in a world where an official needs a second after a play to be like, that was probably holding. Okay, I'll throw the call. Like, I just don't think that there's that amount of grace. You don't have that time.
Exactly right. And I think that's the biggest issue right now with replay and technology, which is great. I think it's becoming where it was designed to be. It was designed to be just like an aid on big game-changing plays. Now it's becoming so ingrained that the officials are deferring to replay. And the thing is, rule on what you see. If you don't see it, all right, let it go. But if you see it and the runner's down, or it's an incomplete pass, or it's holding, make the call and be decisive. And you might be incorrect at the end of the day, but you've got to make those decisions. And that's where that separates the average officials from the really good officials, the ones that can block out the noise, forget about replay, officiate the game, and let replay come in when it's needed.
Belichick has long since aspired for a world where anything could be challenged, and that's been pushed back too. But as somebody that's done this for so long, would that benefit? I mean, having a challenge left I could use on any play seems like that could help some of this.
Yeah, I like it. We did it in the XFL last year. We gave the coaches one challenge. We were very happy with the results, and I did it. It was a learning experience for me, because in my experience, I've made thousands and thousands of decisions on replay, right? Catch, no catch, fumble down by rule, but never in a game was I making decisions on, is this holding or is this pass interference? So it was a learning experience, but it worked. I mean, we overturned 10 incorrect calls that had a big impact on the outcome of games. And I think if you just said, hey, if you got to limit it, you can't give them unlimited challenges, because then we're going to be reviewing everything. But if you gave them one break in case of emergency, and you set a consistent standard. That was the problem in 2019 with defensive and offensive pass interference being reviewable. We never had a consistent standard. If you set the standard and say, here's the bar, here's where it is to be a foul, here's where it is to not be a foul, I think that could work. And I think you could eliminate some of these mistakes that impact games.
I just like deep philosophical thought process here, but we talk about, Brady. You got Brady out here saying that the NFL is worse than ever because of the way that guys are coming up through college, et cetera. I just wonder when you just go to a little league game at this point, the one thing every parent is doing is just destroying the ump, right? Like you go to Pop Warner football, they're destroying the ref. Like at some point, does the sort of tone that we take about officiating, is that going to lead to a spot where we don't have anyone left that wants to officiate football games?
No doubt. Look, we'll always have officials in the NFL and in major college football, but what's happening at the lower levels is there's a lack of officials because of the environment. You have teenagers that are trying to go out and officiate games, and they're getting berated by adults, right? And the parents are the worst. My son plays competitive soccer, and I go to his games, and I shake my head and go, what are we doing? This is somebody that is volunteering their time. They're not making a lot of money so that our kids can play a game and have fun, and we're making their lives miserable, and it's not right. And so what happens is you have these young people that want to do it, and then they have this terrible experience, and they're like, I'm not doing this anymore. And eventually, right, you're going to see the quality of officiating at the higher levels is going to be less because you don't have good people getting in on the ground floor. And that's a problem. And that's a problem across the board with all sports. And we've got to kind of change that narrative. And I don't know what it is, because we've got to figure out a way to humanize these officials, because we just see them as objects. We see them as an object for abuse, whether that's verbal or in some cases physical. And it's really bad in some situations.
And I can hear in my head somebody listening to this saying, oh my God, this has been so pro ref. I think for me, what I constantly say is like, look, there are people that have a bad day and they do a bad job. And that's going to happen sometimes. Like I spent years of my life on tour and music, and, you know, I might play 300 shows a year. And of those 300, 280, 290 of them were great. But you'd have 10 or 15 that you look back and you're like, my God, I played thousands of notes tonight. Some nights you missed them. Like, I think there are bad refs. I think there are refs that have bad days. Those are all very fair to say. I don't buy that everybody walks into that umpire meeting in the beginning of the day and says, all right, God, I hate Mahomes. I want Mahomes to stay home. Like, I just don't feel like, especially when you start talking about the other side, because you mentioned earlier, but what's at stake here is not just playoff seeding, it's also playoff bonuses. Like, there's actual, I cannot imagine a ref saying, you know what, I don't want to feed my family. I want to make sure I screw Chiefs fans. That just doesn't feel real to me, Dean.
No, it doesn't. And you get to this point, and it is. There's playoff assignments, there's playoff bonus pools, there's so much at stake. There's their career is at stake. And again, and I'm not an apologist. I get more frustrated when I see officials make mistakes than anyone. And we all have bad days. I've had bad days. I've gone back on games and go, man, what was I thinking on that call? Like, how did I make that call? And the first person that knows they screwed up is the official themselves. They know after the game whether they worked a good game or a bad game. And there are officials that are good and some that are better than others. And it's the NFL's job to get the best people, but they're just people trying to do a job. And if you're giving them, actually, and I've always said this, when I was at the league office, you're giving me way too much credit if you think I can handle all the things I have to handle, and then on top of that say, I don't like this coach, so we're going to screw him, or I don't like this team. Right? You're giving us too much credit. Sometimes we just miss things, and it happens just like everybody else makes mistakes. But again, at this level, some mistakes they're not acceptable. There are 3 or 4 plays a game that decide the outcome of the game, and the officials do have to be perfect on those plays. And you can't make those mistakes in those situations, but sometimes it does happen.
I don't think people will trust robots more than human beings, but we have seen robot umpires in baseball. Do you see a world at some point where technology is used in that sense, like where we start to see more automation of officiating?
It could. I think especially in football, a lot of times in basketball as well, good officials and a well-officiated game is a well-managed game, right? It's the communication, it's keeping the game moving, and that you need people to do that, right? You need the referee, the white hat, to be communicating with the quarterback and communicating with the coach and just keeping the game moving and making sure that you're managing the game, calling the fouls that have to be called, make sure the flow, make sure there's not a lot of stops and starts. in that, robots, I don't know. Maybe at some point they'll be able to do that, but I do think you need that human element. And there's an opportunity, right? You look at, the goal line technology in soccer, and did the ball cross the plane, and GPS and everything else. So I think there's a world where there's a balance there, but you're always going to need people to officiate these games.
Why not microchip a football, though, Dean? Like, I remember, again, we go back to my Raiders fandom. I remember the note card game where, as a first down, the note card had to decide it. God, it's been hell for me, Dean. Why not throw a microchip in the football?
There are chips in the football. The problem, though, with football is it's not just locating the ball. It's locating the ball at a precise moment in time, right? When the knee was down, when the player stepped out of bounds. So you've got to combine those two things. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now. Yeah, you could do measurements now. You could do measurements with lasers and other things. I like the old school tradition of the chains and the guys running out, and you stretch the chain and the crowd goes crazy or they boo. But look, in a world where technology continues to evolve, you have to continue to stay on the cutting edge and see, are there ways to positively impact officiating with technology, but not bog the game down so much to where it's far into what we're used to. And I think that's the challenge.
So let me put you in front of the owners today, because they bring Dean Blandino in and they say, Dean, what do we need to fix? What would you tell NFL owners today right now needs to be changed?
I think we need to look at the structure of the officiating department. I think we need to put resources into it. I think we need to look at how the officials are being trained, what direction they're being given. I think we're taking too long with replay reviews. I think it's become almost like a committee decision, and everybody has to turn their key to make a decision. I think we got to look at that process, but really just take a deep look into officiating. How are they being trained? How are we bringing officials into the league? What's your scouting process? How are you deciding that this side judge from the ACC is ready for the NFL, and go into that and really take a look at it? Because I think that's where I do feel like on field, like I said, it's better than it was 20 years ago, but I do think the last couple of years, because of relying too much on technology, we're probably not as good as we should be.
So it's interesting when you say it that way, because it makes me think about what an offseason looks like for a ref. And I don't know the answer to this. I mean, we know players go in and they have, OTAs and all these things. I know if I don't do a show for several months, I get a little less rhythm, right? Like if I had to pick up a violin today and try and play with country band, I wouldn't be my best. Like, what does the offseason program look like for an official?
Yeah, it's similar to the players in that, the officials have a CBA that's negotiated. Their union negotiates it with the league, and they have a negotiated time off, just like the players do. So after the Super Bowl, there's a window from the end of the Super Bowl to May 15th where that's their time off. And if the league wants them to do anything, they have to negotiate with the union, negotiate compensation. So I don't necessarily agree. I think that's too long. I think there are opportunities in the offseason, like, hey, spring football league, can we get some of our officials, our younger officials, our less experienced officials, opportunities in a spring football league? Can we get them now with OTAs? Officials will go to OTAs and work with the clubs. They'll go to training camps. They're having virtual meetings. They have officiating clinics. So there are things that they're doing during the off season. But again, it's just like anything else. We talk about full-time officials. There's only so much they can do in season, right? They work their game. They're looking at film. They're scouting their opponents, the upcoming teams that they're going to work. But I do think there's opportunities, in the offseason to get them together more, to go through the different areas. Here's offensive holding. We're going to talk to our umpires and our referees. Here's the pass interference. We're going to talk to our downfield officials. And just continue to just kind of prepare them for the upcoming season. And then also the physical part of it and getting them ready and kind of ramping them up as we get closer to the start of the preseason, getting their bodies prepared for that.
So you mentioned spring football. One thing I loved in the XFL that you were part of was the new kickoff formation. We saw that Troy Vincent basically already told us that kickoffs aren't working in the NFL. If you were going to the NFL now, would you recommend that they change to the XFL style of kickoffs?
Yeah, I do. I think I'd love to look at the injury data, what they have on the kickoffs. Obviously, the kickoff, I think Troy said it was it's ceremonial dead play. You look at the numbers, 24 0.5% of all kickoffs are returned, right? So when you think that's 2 out of every 10 kickoffs. So it's just touchback after touchback after touchback. They added the fair catch now. So it's a non-play where the XFL kickoff is a football play. And look, small sample size, but it's not a higher rate of injury than on other scrimmage downs. So I think it's something the league needs to look at if you want to keep the play in the game. It's a drastic change from the traditional kickoff. But again, I think you sometimes have to look at drastic measures if your other alternative is getting rid of the play completely and just putting the ball in the 25. I don't think that's the right way to go. I think the kickoff is such a big part of the game. I think it can be a great play again. I think it can be something that is exciting and safe. I think the XFL kickoff is a path the NFL needs to kind of explore.
I also watched A.J. McCarron convert a couple of fourth and 15 onside kicks in the XFL. I loved it, frankly. Maybe it's because I feel like onside kicks just never get recovered. It's so rare. But the concept of 4th and 15, you got to convert it to keep it. Feels like you're putting the ball in Mahomes' hands again in a Super Bowl for an onside kick. That feels glorious to me. Should the NFL implement that as well in your mind?
I like it, yeah. And the Eagles actually proposed it last year. It didn't get enough traction. I like the idea. If you just make it an option, that if you want to go normal onside, keep the kicking game in the game. Sure, go normal onside. But who doesn't want to see Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts and all our great quarterbacks with the ball and a chance to keep the game moving with a 4th down conversion? It's exciting. It was exciting in the XFL, and as the onside kick, as those numbers, they've decreased. The last year or so, where it's a 4% play. I mean, it's almost impossible. And the onside kick is critical to close games, because if you don't have a viable option to get the ball back after scoring, then you're down multiple scores with 3 minutes to go. Game over. It's done. There's no chance. And the NFL certainly does not want that. Nobody does. We want close games. We want exciting games. And so you need a viable option to keep the ball after scoring.
What were your impressions of the XFL? I think one of the more controversial rules for a lot of people, you had the choice of the 1, 2, or 3 point conversion after a touchdown. Did you like that as it went through the season?
Yeah, we did. I really liked it because the 3 points, we're working toward, we want closer games. We're trying to promote close games. And so now with 3 point try, 9 point game is a 1-score game. So we really liked it. A lot of the teams utilized it. And we liked where the success rate was. So, spring football, 1, 2, 3. I think we'll continue that going forward. And it was positive. All the feedback was positive on that.
Well, and it felt like it is an analytics nerd's dream come true, right? Because the by 4 or 5 weeks in, we were looking at the percentages of the 1 point versus the 2 point, and is there an advantage? It just feel like you just going down a whole rabbit hole of it. But to your point, it kept games exciting, which I really liked. One controversial tackle rule right now happening: the hip drop tackle looks like it's going to be eliminated. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I'm all for player safety. I just think the league has to define it clearly and then give the officials good direction on when to call it. I do think it's getting harder for defensive players to make tackles, especially out in space, when a lot of times you have a smaller defensive back trying to tackle a bigger body, whether that's a tight end or even a bigger receiver. So I do think they clearly have to define it. I think it's similar. The action is similar to a horse collar. The difference with the horse collar is you grab the back of the collar, the side of the collar, and that the officials can see pretty clearly. I think with this hip drop, I just worry about officials calling fouls that aren't there. And they're big penalties, right? 15 yards. So again, all for player safety. I hate to see those types of injuries. If the league feels that it's necessary to make this change, they just got to define it clearly. This is a horse collar. This is a hip drop tackle. This isn't. This is what will be a foul. This will not be. And just make sure the officials have that good direction. But it is. And I do think it's a direct result of not being able, a lot of times you can't go high, right? Head, neck area. So you're trying to wrap around the body, your legs swing around. If they do pass a rule like that, we're probably going to have some fouls that it's unintended consequences. But again, if it's all about player safety, it's hard to argue against it.
That leads to arguments on the field. That leads to contention. And it makes me think about that Mahomes moment for a minute here again, because one thing we're used to in the NBA, like we know certain players have contentious relationships with certain officials. What do you do as a ref if you're doing the next Chiefs game and you're coming off? Like if you are the person that just got yelled at ad nauseum in every press conference in America, how do you handle that the next time you're officiating a Chiefs game?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, look, that crew, what we would normally do, that crew won't work a Chiefs game the rest of the season. You just try to avoid that. You try just for the officials, for everybody involved. You don't want it to be a story, so you don't put that crew on a Chiefs game the rest of the way. But that crew now has to go in and work whatever game they're going to work. And that was the challenge always for me. You want to hold the officials accountable. You want to make sure that they correct the mistakes that they make. But you can't. Everybody, the media, everybody is burying them. And they got to go out and work a game. And it's like being a head coach. It's being a leader. When everything is really, you kind of have that bunker mentality where you've got to get these officials ready to go and say, forget about last week, forget about what happened. Because if you're thinking about last week, I guarantee you're going to go in and you're going to mess something up this week. And then we're just going to be the same thing and it's going to snowball. So it's that kind of that personal side where you're trying to build them up, build up their confidence, put them in a position to be successful. And that's a challenge because you're dealing with people. And trust me, the officials, they feel worse than anyone when they make a mistake. And you're just trying to keep that morale up high because it's an environment that is usually very negative. And that's like we talked about. It's a hard environment to work in.
One more thought that brings up when you talk about it, because again, the way social media yells about all this, but imbalanced games. Oh, this team had no penalties and this team had 14. And, you see so many fans of bad teams saying, well, the refs have it out for me. We talked earlier about how teams know the officials. When the officials walk in, do they have a sense of this team has more holding, this team commits more personal fouls? Like even if it's subconscious, is there some sort of, I know I'm taking on this team and I got to have a watchful eye on that?
Well, they do. They scout the two teams. So that crew, once their evaluation of their previous game is over and they've kind of put that aside, they'll start looking forward to next week. And so if I'm doing the Eagles-Cowboys game, we're going to look at film. We're going to look at if they played this year already, we're going to look at the last time they played. We're going to look at their last 2 or 3 games, just like the teams do, and look for tendencies. Not that they're going to single out a specific player, but they're going to look, right? You're working the Eagles. You got to be ready for the brotherly shove. How are we officiating this? What are things we have to look for? Does Dallas, do they play more aggressive in the secondary? Do we have to be prepared for that? What do they like to do in short yardage situations? What do they do on punts? Do they double the gunners? So all of these things go into being prepared to officiate that game. And then they meet with the clubs, both teams before the game, 90 minutes before the game to go over, do you have any trick plays? Do you have anything that we need to be aware of going in? Just so everybody's on the same page. So there is a lot of prep work that goes in, but very rarely are you looking at, hey, we got to watch 72 because all this guy does is hold. Because if you put that in your head too much, you're going to subconsciously, you're going to create a foul probably that isn't there. So you're trying to think big picture. You're trying to look at tendencies but they are preparing for that, for their upcoming game.
All I know, Dean, is that the world would be better if we could just clone. We'd need like 18 of you so that there's a few that we could put in. I just want to see a world where I got Dean Blandino sitting up in the booth, mic'd up, telling everybody what happens because A, it's great TV, B, it gets the call right, and C, it just shuts up all the yelling. Man, I genuinely appreciate your insight on all of this. I think if we would stop yelling about officiating and start listening about some of the nuance to it, we'd become smarter fans. And just like smarter fans make for better football consumption, I still believe smarter fans makes for better officiating consumption too. So follow him on Twitter at Dean Blandino. Of course, that's the way you can get some of his brilliance there. My friend, I appreciate your time. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Thanks for having me and having the conversation.
Time to hang out with my buddy Michael Lombardi. And Michael, I've been excited for this conversation because we'll get to Belichick and important things, but I got to let my fandom shine through for a minute. I was at the game on Sunday watching my beloved Raiders not be able to score against the Minnesota Vikings. But tell me this, if you're Adrian Peterson and you're trying to show the world that you deserve that job, should they have considered a quarterback change in your mind during that game?
Well, I think there's no question. I don't know what Antonio Pierce was thinking about, really. I mean, I was watching the game. You were watching the game. Like, why didn't he make a quarterback change? Like, at some point, you've got to decide, like, what must happen to win the game. Here, I've said this many times. The first quarter in every NFL game is the assessment of the game. Did we game plan correctly? Do we understand who they are? Do we have the right thing going? The second and the third quarter are all about adjustments. The fourth quarter becomes a standalone game. How do we win the game? How do we win the game? And I don't think he addressed any one of the quarters. He just stood there and watched, and that wasn't smart. And he didn't give his team a chance to win. I don't know if he was mandated to not play Garoppolo because he comes from the past era, but it was a mistake.
And by the way, you saved me like a great teammate. AP. I went Adrian Peterson instead of Antonio Pierce. I don't know.
I mess up on everybody's name. Don't worry about it.
Freudian slip there.
Yeah, I mess up on. But I think the bigger issue here, Fitz, is the Raider way. And here's where I would say you're a young man. Most people that were not born, that were born after 1983, the last time the Raiders won a Super Bowl, really don't know the Raider way. They know the Raider brand. They know the shield. They know the silver and black. But they certainly cannot say they know the Raider way, because since that time, that team has won 44% of their games. Since the Super Bowl in 2002, they've won 37% of their games. They've only been to the playoffs 14 times in 40 years. So the Raider way of excellence, this Raider way of Super Bowls, is something that's predated to 83. And all the people that quote it, Pierce being one, he was 5. You're talking the brand. You're not talking the way.
And the funny thing about that, and I think realistically, when you talk about the Raider way, it used to be about winning. At this point, I really don't care about anything other than watching my favorite team win. But there's philosophically here, like we've talked before, like maybe you just have to get lucky when you're hiring coaches. I would say this is a harsh way to say this. So, forgive me here for a second for Mark Davis. Mark Davis is, I think, kind of a weird dude, right? Like he's kind of a hard to talk to. He's not like when you're at a party and a guy walks in, some guys are just personable. Some guys are a little bit off. Like Mark's kind of a weird dude. In today's NFL, you have to hire coaches that relate to players. What do you do if a weird dude's trying to figure out who's not weird? You see what I'm saying? Like, it just feels like, what do you do when your owner is just bad at making hiring decisions?
Well, I think the owner is bad at asking the right question. They keep talking about the Raider way, right? Yet nobody defines it. Nobody understands. They like to torch every game, but do they really understand what the father stood for? Going back to the Brooklyn Dodgers. I mean, I got involved in scouting because as a young kid, I read everything I could read on Al Davis. As a young kid, I wanted to study personnel. I wanted to understand how to build a team. And the Raiders have lost their art of team building. That's really what they are. The Raiders, he stood for dominance in the offensive and the defensive line. You cannot say that the Raider team over the last 20 years has been dominant in that at all. You can't say that. You can say, the Raider way is about the players. Yeah, well, the problem is the generation that we're in today, the game to win requires a lot of attention to detail. It requires discipline. It requires accountability. Back in those days, maybe not as much. It wasn't chess on grass in the 60s. Now it is. And so you've got to advance the way. I mean, look, A&P controlled all the grocery. In the 40s, A&P, 10% of the grocery market belonged to A&P. They were Google. They were McDonald's back then. They're non-existent today. If you don't keep up on change and adapt, you become non-existent. Now, in the NFL, you don't have to worry about it because the salary cap and the revenue sharing keeps you profitable.
It's interesting. There's a book called Good to Great. I would recommend everybody go check it out. It outlines companies from different eras that just simply failed. And maybe Mark Davis should turn around and read that. Okay, but there's a revolving door at coach and quarterback for that franchise. Now the Patriots feel like they're living a little bit of what so many other teams live. There's a revolving door at quarterback. Now there's all sorts of rumors that at this point, that from substantial good sources, that the decision has been made. The organization is going to move on from Belichick. I mean, I guess, number one, if you were there in New England, would you move on from Bill?
I consider Bill one of my closest friends, so I would never move on from Bill. I say that to you as somebody that has great respect, and I've learned tremendous amounts of football from him. And I think he's still at the top of his game. And you can take that as a friend, defending a friend, that's fine. But I would say if he lost it, his energy level, his passion for the game is still at an extreme level. His attention to detail is still there. I think after this so many years, I think people sometimes sometimes need a fresh look. And this team has lost 8 games by 7 points or less. They have the worst field goal kicker in the National Football League when they went with the kicker, and that cost them some games. And so they're not as bad as 3-10, and certainly they're not a 10-3 team. They have issues. They got to fix the quarterback. But I can't imagine you can find somebody that's a better coach than Bill. You can find somebody out there that will work kind of in a more collaborative effort if that's really what you want to do. The question is, can we replace Bill? No, the answer is no. What the real answer is, if you want to have more say within the franchise, if you want to take away the dictatorship and the one-man model that is going on, then you're time for a change. And I think that's where Mr. Kraft has to answer. Do I want a more collaborative organization for the next 10 years, or do I want to stick with this model? Because as my wife always tells me, there's not another Belichick out there. So you got to figure out some other way. And I think that's where Kraft is right now.
Again, having watched my favorite team have 20 coaches stand on the sidelines over a 12-year period, be careful what you wish for in the revolving door. But, realistically, would there be a world in your mind where Belichick and the Patriots could figure out how to be more collaborative instead of him going somewhere else and them finding somebody else? Why not work it out together?
Well, I think there lies, and that's why I said this on my pod. I said it on my show, that there's going to have to be a meeting to decide that. And I think that if Kraft or Mr. Kraft wants to just get rid of Bill, then he's already decided that Bill won't do that, or they've had those meetings. And I don't know that. I'm not privy to those conversations. The idea that they could trade him certainly comes into play. But, look, the reason Sean Payton got traded is he had 1 year left on his contract. If Mr. Kraft decides to move on from Bill, then he's not going to be able to trade Bill because he's firing him. He's essentially firing him, and that contract becomes null and void.
So at this point, where do you think a good landing spot for Bill would be?
Well, I asked this question this way. If you called Andy Reid on the phone and said, Andy, who's the last coach you want to get the Charger job? Who do you think he would say? Belichick. If you called Philadelphia up and said, who's the last coach you want the Josh Harris to hire? He'd say Belichick. If you called the Panthers up, if you called the Atlanta Falcons or the Bucks or any of those teams, to me, I think wherever there's an opening that wants a culture, that wants somebody to come in and build a structure, then he's the right guy.
I cannot imagine a division that has Andy Reid, Sean Payton, and Bill Belichick all standing on this. That is a different level of coaching acumen. What is next in your mind for the Chargers? Is Herbert's out for the rest of the year with the broken finger? What's next for LA?
Well, I think they've already reached what's next. I think the fact that, Keenan Allen's not going to play tonight in the game, I think they know they need to move on. I think the real question is that most people see this as an easy answer, right? We need somebody to help Justin Herbert win. Well, that's not the problem with your team. You need to get him to play better, but you need to play complementary football with him. You need to have a defense and an offense that can complement one another along with the kicking game. You need somebody to come in and build the team the right way around his strengths. And I'm not sure that just hiring a positional coach to call plays is the answer. Remember, how many times do we have to listen to all offseason how Kellen Moore was going to change their offense and how Mike McCarthy was going to destroy the Cowboys' offense? How do you think that's worked out?
So if you were right now making a hire in the NFL for a team like the Chargers, we'll make you the Chargers GM for a minute. Do you want somebody that's a first-time head coach, or do you want somebody that's been there before?
I want somebody who's won games. Because you just said it. I got to compete with Sean Payton. I got to compete with Andy Reid. I don't want somebody who's learned on the job. They're going to kill them. I got 2 elite coaches. I got 2 Hall of Fame coaches in this division. I got to go beat them. I'm not going to beat them with somebody I'm not sure can do the job. I need a proven product here. Same thing with the Raiders. I mean, the Raiders have had 18 coaches since 1983. They better get themselves somebody who knows how to build a team, because they're competing against a great team builder in Andy Reid with a great quarterback, and Sean Payton, who's got an ability to coach and manage a team and win, even though he doesn't have a great quarterback.
Yeah, that's the wildest part of it is like I continue to look at the Chiefs and remind everybody that it's not just Mahomes. Like Mahomes is phenomenal. I'm not taking anything away, but there is a tag team here of Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes that has to impact the way anybody. Like if you're looking at the Chargers job, you got to ask yourself, who can you get that's going to be able to be as good as Andy Reid? Because you already invested in Justin Herbert. So that means, Michael, you must think that Herbert can go out year in and year out and compete with Mahomes. Now you got to find a coach that can compete with Andy Reid. That just doesn't sound easy.
Yeah, no, I think oftentimes what happens is, the search to look for a coach always begins with the wrong question. And therefore you end up with the wrong answer. That's like Animal House. They all had the answers to the test. The problem was it was the wrong test. And so that's what happens. You ask the wrong questions, you get the wrong answer.
What is the question everybody should ask?
The question is, how do we enhance Justin Herbert in a three-dimensional way? How do we make this team play right and left-handed, win with offense, win with defense? How are we multidimensional? How can we bring somebody in with a track record that can do that?
I think the interesting part of that, and we've talked about this before, I've always heard this, that part of the interview for most candidates is coming in with essentially a book of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. I think candidates would be surprised if they were walking into an interview for the Chargers job and the first question was, how are we building complementary football, Michael? Like that's why you sit in the seat that you sit in and I sit in this one. I wouldn't have thought of that. That's what makes him great. Michael hosts the Lombardi Line on VSiN weekdays, 1 p.m. Eastern, weekends, 10 a.m. Eastern, as well as the GM Shuffle podcast. Check out all of his NFL takes at vsin.com. My friend, I always appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jason.
That's it for us. We'll be back on Sunday night. Frank Schwab, I'm not going to lie. I got Frank tickets to the Raiders Thursday night football game, so he'll either love me or hate me. But we will break everything down from Sunday's action, as we always do on Sunday night Blitz. It's a blast. We get all of the immediate emotion out. We go through every single game, no matter how great they are, no matter how much they suck. We break them all down. So you got to make sure you hang out with us. And hang out with us on social media. I'm at Jason Fitz on all platforms. Easy to find me. Stone doing God's work behind the glasses at SJ Rochelle. Easy to find him. Make sure you give him a follow. Just not only is he staggeringly good looking, but he also does great work. In the meantime, leave us that 5-star review, rate, subscribe, tell your friends, your family, your enemies. Tell everybody that what they need to do is hang out with us every single week. We'll be back next Thursday with more Zero Blitz.